Draco Mihawk and Shanks Figureland are two of the most narratively potent characters Oda has ever created. And what makes them so fascinating is that they function almost as philosophical mirrors of each other. One man became the strongest swordsman alive and found nothing waiting for him at the summit. The other became one of the four most powerful pirates on the sea, then spent his entire career pretending the power was incidental. Mihawk is power without leadership. Shanks is leadership without the need to prove power. And the reason One Piece needs both of them standing at the peak, gazing down at Zoro and Luffy respectively, is that they represent the two possible futures for the Straw Hats core duo. Not warnings exactly, more like thesis statements about what strength costs and what it can become. Put simply, Oda intentionally designed Mihawk and Shanks as two answers to a single question: what happens when you reach the top? And what do you owe the world once you're there? But Elbaf has rewritten this equation in ways that make it far more interesting, because now we know something we didn't before. Shanks Figureland was once a devoted blade of God, a sworn weapon of the celestial dragons, tattooed with a covenant that bound him to Emu. Shanks didn't simply choose piracy over privilege. He infiltrated the system from the inside, freed Fisher Tiger and the slaves of Mary Joe, and then severed his own covenant by losing his arm to a Sea King in East Blue. What we thought for over 1,000 chapters, that the arm was simply a sacrifice for Luffy, isn't anymore. It was an escape from God. Put simply, Mihawk crystallizes the idea that perfection in isolation is a kind of death. Shanks crystallizes the idea that power only matters when you're willing to destroy your own to set someone else free. And the entire architecture of One Piece's endgame depends on Zoro and Luffy understanding and ultimately surpassing those philosophies. Mihawk sits atop the world of swordsmanship, the way a king sits on an empty throne in an empty castle, which, by the way, is literally what he does. He lives on Kuraigana Island, inside the ruins of the fallen Shikaru Kingdom, a land so devastated by past war that even the local human drills became violent from watching human conflict. Mihawk, the world's strongest swordsman in both name and actuality, dwells in the aftermath of what unchecked violence produces. His castle stands intact, but the kingdom around it is rubble. He has no crew, he has no flag, until Cross Guild. For decades, he sailed the Grand Line alone in a coffin-shaped raft with a single seat and a single black sail. He destroyed Dawn Krieg's armada of 50 ships and 5,000 men by himself. Not for any grand purpose, but apparently because they crossed his path. He followed the survivors back to East Blue purely to kill time. The interesting thing is that Mihawk's dominance is not performed. He doesn't showboat. He doesn't build a reputation through spectacle. He simply is the strongest, and the world orbits around that fact whether he wants it to or not. Before he was a warlord, he was the Marine Hunter, and according to SBS Volume 108, that title stems from a genuine betrayal by the Marines that Mihawk never forgave. He is, in the purest narrative sense, the final boss of an individual dream, Zoro's dream. Shanks is the inverse. He commands one of the most feared crews on the seas, a crew with remarkably zero devil fruit users, and his power is expressed almost entirely through presence rather than action. Consider the resume. He ended the Paramount War at Marineford by walking onto the battlefield. He scared off Admiral Greenbull with Conqueror's Haki from miles away. He one-shot Kid and awakened Supernova with a bounty in the billions. With a single divine departure, he intercepted Kaido from reaching Marineford through means still unclear, but presumably involving the sheer threat of engagement. And yet the defining image of Shanks is not violence. It's the party. It's the laugh. It's the man who let bandits dump sake on his head and grinned about it, then turned apocalyptic the moment they threatened a child he cared about. Shanks doesn't need to prove power because everyone already knows. His restraint is the display. Here's the paradox though, and Elbaf makes it infinitely deeper. Mihawk, who has nothing to prove, compulsively tests himself against the worthy. Whitebeard at Marineford, Luffy out of curiosity, Zoro as a long-term investment. Shanks, who has everything to prove given his celestial dragon lineage, his time as a devoted blade, and his suspicious proximity to the Gorosei, almost never fights. One man seeks meaning through combat because he has nothing else. The other avoids it. The Barity duel is one of the most structurally perfect scenes in all of One Piece, and it establishes Mihawk's entire function in the story. Zoro challenges him. Mihawk, amused, maybe a little sad, unsheathes his kogatana, a cross-shaped knife pendant the size of a dinner fork, and uses it to block all three of Zoro's swords. It is, simultaneously, the most disrespectful and the most honest thing anyone has ever done to Zoro. But then something shifts. Zoro, bleeding, broken, refuses to step back. He'd rather die than retreat from his vow to Kuina. And Mihawk, stoic, analytical, emotionally constipated Mihawk, does something extraordinary. He respects it. He draws Yoru, the supreme grade Blackblade, and delivers the finishing blow across Zoro's chest, deliberately holding back enough to let him survive. Then he tells Zoro to surpass him. He asks Zoro's name. he remembers it. From that moment on, Mihawk becomes the gatekeeper of an individual dream. He tracks Zoro's progress. He later agrees to train him for 2 years on Kuraigana, but only after Zoro bows his head and begs, discarding his pride as a swordsman. Mihawk initially dismisses this request, thinking Zoro had failed to the human drills. But when Zoro reveals he already conquered them all, Mihawk laughs. One of only 2 times he's been seen laughing in the entire series. He sees in Zoro's humility exactly what he once failed to understand about Shanks' sacrifice. That surrendering your pride for someone else's sake isn't weakness. It's a different kind of strength. This is crucial. Mihawk's training of Zoro is not purely transactional. It's Mihawk investing in the idea that someone might one day give his existence at the top, meaning by taking it from him. Shanks doesn't train Luffy. He doesn't teach him a single technique. He barely spends any time with him at all. And yet Shanks is the reason the entire story happens. The scene is almost too iconic to need retelling. Young Luffy drowns. Shanks saves him from the Sea King. He loses his arm in the process, then tells Whitebeard he betted on the new generation. The arm is the thesis statement of One Piece before the story even properly begins. I kind of feel like it's the story telling us that the most powerful thing you can do is sacrifice something irreplaceable for someone who isn't yet what they're going to become. But here's what the Elbaf flashback changes. Chapter 1167 confirmed that Shanks bore the tattoo of a devoted blade covenant on his left arm, the same arm he lost. Chapter 1168 strongly implies that by losing that arm, Shanks severed his covenant with the world government and Imu. The sacrifice wasn't just saving Luffy, it was simultaneously cutting the chain that bound him to the Celestial Dragons, one act which resulted in 2 liberations. He freed a boy's future and freed himself from God in the same movement. Mihawk, who once saw Shanks as a worthy rival, called him a one-armed has-been when they met in East Blue. And this isn't just cruelty, it's genuine resentment. Mihawk cannot comprehend why someone would voluntarily diminish themselves. It offends his worldview. To Mihawk, strength is the only currency that matters, and Shanks spent a fortune of it on a kid who ate a rubber devil fruit. But here's what Mihawk misses, and what the entire story will eventually vindicate. Shanks didn't lose anything. He invested. And more than that, he freed himself from a system of cosmic bondage that Mihawk, in his isolation, never even had to confront. The legendary rivalry between Mihawk and Shanks is one of One Piece's great off-screen events. Whitebeard himself acknowledged these duels as famous, their clashes shaking the Grand Line even before either man had fully ascended. The Vivre card data book reveals something remarkable. Mihawk is waiting for someone stronger than Shanks to one day appear. If Mihawk were weaker than Shanks, he wouldn't need someone stronger. Shanks himself would still be enough of a challenge. The phrasing suggests Mihawk at minimum equaled Shanks in swordsmanship, and now tragically has no one left. And then Shanks went to a backwater village in East Blue and gave his arm to a child. The duel stopped. The question the story poses here is deceptively simple. Why? The surface answer is that Mihawk refused to fight a one-armed opponent on pride grounds. But the deeper answer, the one the narrative now supports with the Elbaf revelations, is that Mihawk and Shanks had a philosophical break, not just a physical one. The timeline matters. Shanks served as a devoted blade around age 24 to 25, approximately 15 years ago. He left that role, went to Elbaf, stole the Gum Gum fruit, and ended up in Fuchsia Village where he lost his arm roughly 12 to 13 years ago. Somewhere in this sequence, he stopped being the man Mihawk recognized. He stopped fighting like someone trying to prove something and started fighting, or more accurately, not fighting, like someone who had already decided what mattered. When Shanks gave up his arm, he wasn't just losing a limb and breaking a covenant. He was graduating from the paradigm that gave Mihawk's life meaning. The two swordsmen used to speak the same language, steel against steel, truth through combat. Shanks switched languages. He started speaking in sacrifice, in investment, in futures. And Mihawk, fluent only in the blade, was left without a conversation partner. Mihawk post-rivalry is one of the most existentially trapped characters in One Piece. He's so bored that he destroys pirate fleets for entertainment. He's so understimulated that he enters the Paramount War at Marineford, primarily hoping to test the gap between himself and Whitebeard, only for Diamond Jozu to block his slash. Whitebeard has allies, people willing to intercept on his behalf. This moment quietly devastates Mihawk. He never gets his answer. Whitebeard doesn't even look at him. The strongest swordsman in the world is, in the context of the war's actual stakes, irrelevant. Shanks, meanwhile, has graduated into something beyond dueling entirely. He doesn't pursue the One Piece despite presumably being capable of it, at least not until Luffy awakened Nika, which is its own deeply suspicious detail. He operates more like a geopolitical force, a thermostat for the world's temperature. Too hot, he shows up and the war ends. A Yonko moving toward Marineford, he intercepts Kaido. A supernova threatening Elbaf, one swing. Shanks fights only when the alternative is worse, and even then, he fights as briefly as possible. And I don't think it's passivity. This is the restraint of someone who has seen Imu's covenant system from the inside and knows exactly what unchecked power leads to. It produces Kuraigana Islands, and worse. Mihawk's entire aesthetic is reduction. Tiny boat, cross-pendant knife. He talks as little as possible. He enters scenes like a scalpel and leaves when the cut is made. His restraint is personal. He restrains because excess is beneath him. When he tells Zoro, "I'll wait for you at the top," is a quiet confession that he has nothing else to do. Shanks' restraint is strategic, and the Elbaf revelations have made it clear this was always the case. He restrained himself at Marineford not just because he's a peacekeeper, but because, as a former devoted blade, he understood the institutional architecture of violence better than any other pirate alive. When Shanks walks into Marineford and proposes ending the war, the real argument is the unstated one. Do you really want to find out what happens if I take a side? Sengoku accepts not because of the logic, but because of what happens if he doesn't. And now consider this. Chapter 1167 showed Shanks playing the arrogant celestial dragon perfectly, calling Harold a peon, demanding not to be addressed as an equal, performing nobility with such conviction that even Garling believed it. He then used that cover to free Fisher Tiger, enabling the liberation of every slave in Mary Jo, including the Boa sisters and Koala. This wasn't a simple, spontaneous display of compassion on his end. This was deep cover espionage. So when you look at Shanks' restraint throughout the story, not fighting when he could, not chasing the One Piece when he could, smiling when anyone else would rage, you have to wonder, how much of Shanks' entire public persona is a performance? And how much of Mihawk's solitude is the result of never needing to perform at all? Compare two iconic postures. Mihawk draws lines for individuals. Surpass this sword. Shanks draws lines for the world, arriving, standing, and letting everyone calculate the cost of defiance. Mihawk's restraint is the discipline of a perfectionist. Shanks' restraint is the discipline of a spy who has been playing the longest game in the story. When Mihawk uses violence, it's aesthetic. The slash that splits the iceberg at Marineford, the casual knife fight with Zoro. Even his destruction of Krieg's fleet has a kind of horrible elegance. One man, one sword, 50 ships. When Shanks uses violence, it's final. Divine Departure on Kid isn't a duel. He executed a man's ambition, the Conqueror's hockey burst that dropped vice admirals to their knees. The implied clash with Kaido handled off-screen because what matters isn't how Shanks fights, but that he chose to. Mihawk lives alone. He farms on his cursed island. He reads the newspaper with mild interest when the Straw Hats do something entertaining. His only consistent companions over the time skip are Perona, a ghost princess he tolerates with gruff affection, and Zoro, whom he trains with the intensity of someone who knows this is the only meaningful relationship he's going to have for a while. And there's something heartbreaking about it. When Perona decides to leave, Mihawk doesn't stop her. He tells her to be safe. He'd already anticipated the warlord system's dissolution and had her leave for her own protection. This is a man who, despite his isolation, has learned to care. Just quietly, incompetently, from behind the wall he built between himself and the world. The cross-guild partnership with Crocodile is telling. Both share a deep distrust of others born from past betrayal. Mihawk by the Marines, Crocodile by the system generally. The alliance works precisely because neither of them expects warmth, just competence and mutual self-interest. Mihawk joining Cross Guild might actually be the most liberated decision he's ever made, because it means admitting, however reluctantly, that he needs other people. Shanks is surrounded. His crew adores him. He throws parties. He laughs at insults. Ben Beckman, his first mate, is one of the most respected right-hand men in the entire story. The Red Hair Pirate's reputation as the most balanced Emperor crew, with the highest average bounty, speaks to a captain who elevates everyone around him. But Oda keeps pulling back the curtain on what the smile hides, and every layer is darker than the last. Shanks is a figureland, a celestial dragon by birth. His twin brother Shamrock leads the Holy Knights, one of the strongest military forces aligned with Imu. Their father Garling is now an elder, having replaced Saturn after the Egghead incident. Shanks returned to this family after Roger's death. He wore their uniform. He bore their mark. He called a giant king a peon to maintain his cover, and then he destroyed it all. He freed slaves. He broke his covenant. He sailed back to the sea and spent the next decade laughing at bandits and giving his hat to a kid. But what does Shanks fear exactly? The story points towards something specific, the wrong outcome. Not the wrong person finding the One Piece exactly, but the wrong conditions. He only moved toward the One Piece after Luffy's Nika awakening. He stole the Gum Gum fruit in the first place, seemingly on information from Roger about Joy Boy's return. His interventions, stopping wars, crushing ambitious rookies who move too fast, intercepting emperors, all read like someone managing a timeline. He's not a pirate in the traditional sense. He's a chess player disguised as a party host, operating with insider knowledge of a cosmic game that Mihawk doesn't even know is being played. Mihawk fears irrelevance, an empty throne with no challenger. Shanks fears the wrong kind of relevance, a world that changes before the right person is ready to change it. The world talks about Mihawk in the language of impossibility, the strongest swordsman in the world, a monster superior to monsters. Don Krieg's men assumed he had devil fruit powers because no human could do what he does. His bounty of 3.5 billion berries, calculated partly because the Marines believe Cross Guild wouldn't exist without him, speaks to a man mythologized as a weapon, not a person. The world talks about Shanks in the language of awe and confusion. He's an emperor who doesn't conquer territory like Kaido or Big Mom did. He's a pirate who can walk into Mary Jo, and now we know why. He was born there. He inspires fanatical loyalty in a crew that, by all accounts, genuinely enjoys being pirates in the most old-fashioned sense. His bounty has never been as publicly emphasized as his influence, which is harder to quantify because influence works in silence. Mihawk doesn't really talk about himself. He defines himself through action and title. "I am the world's strongest swordsman," is stated with the same tone one might use to say, "It's Tuesday." Shanks barely acknowledges his own power at all. He talks about Luffy. He talks about the new generation. But after chapter 1167, every one of those conversations is shadowed by what we now know. Shanks has seen the inside of the system. He's worn the uniform. And he chose to burn it all down from within. Which of them is closer to the myth the world protrudes? Mihawk. He is the weapon the world imagines. No hidden layers, no secret agendas, no celestial dragon heritage. What you see is what you get. The perfect swordsman, alone, waiting. Shanks subverts his myth at every turn. The world sees an emperor. The truth is a former celestial dragon who infiltrated his own family, freed slaves, broke a covenant with God, lost his arm to sever the bond, and has been playing both sides of the world's power structure for over a decade. The world sees a cheerful captain. The truth is the most dangerous double agent in the history of the Grand Line. Mihawk at Barity chooses to acknowledge Zoro's will by giving him both a scar and a future. He holds back just enough with Yoru to let Zoro live, then tells him to surpass him. This is Mihawk being generous. And generosity for Mihawk means allowing someone to exist as a worthy opponent. Shanks in Fuchsia Village chooses to lose his arm rather than risk Luffy's life, and simultaneously severs his covenant with the Celestial Dragons. This is Shanks being selfless on two planes at once. He diminishes himself physically so that Luffy's story can begin, and he liberates himself spiritually so his own story can finally be real. Mihawk invests in Zoro's dream because it validates his own existence. Shanks invests in Luffy's dream because he believes it matters more than his own body, and more than his own throne in the Holy Land. Mihawk at Marineford enters the war hoping to test himself against Whitebeard, gets blocked by Jozu, chases Luffy out of curiosity, leaves when Shanks arrives, stating it was beyond the scope of his agreement. Shanks at Marineford arrives at the war's end, proposes peace. Everyone agrees, because everyone calculates the cost of disagreement. Mihawk treats Marineford as a personal opportunity, a chance to answer private questions about power. Shanks treats it as a fire that must be extinguished before it burns the entire framework of the world he's been carefully managing. Mihawk training Zoro forbids him from drinking alcohol until he masters armament hockey, is strict, demanding, and, in his own stunted way, proud. Shanks never teaches Luffy anything technical, instead, gives him a hat, a dream, and a wound to the ego. You're not ready to be a pirate. The training is entirely motivational. Mihawk wants to be surpassed. Shanks simply wants to be continued. When Mihawk accepted the warlord position as a practical compromise, a truce with the Marines who once hunted him and whom he once hunted. When the system dissolved, he didn't mourn it. He just needed a new arrangement, which became Cross Guild. On the other end, Shanks returned to Mary Jo, accepted the covenant, wore the uniform, bore the tattoo, all as a deep cover operation to destabilize the system from within. When he left, he didn't just walk away. He freed the slaves first. Mihawk cooperated with the system out of convenience and left when convenience ended. Shanks infiltrated the system out of conviction and destroyed a piece of it on his way out. One man is indifferent to the world's institutions. The other man is at war with them. Mihawk's design literally screams weapon. The hawk eyes with concentric rings. Yoru is cross-shaped. His pendant is a cross. His very silhouette on the horizon forms a crucifix. The Black Blade Yoru, permanently imbued with haki through countless battles. A sword that became what it is through nothing but repetition and mastery. The ornate Spanish swordsman aesthetic. Shanks' design represents a human. Red hair, which is in some sense the most emotionally loud color. A missing arm, the most visible mark of sacrifice. The straw hat that isn't even his, that he gave away to a child, and that now defines the protagonist of the entire story. His sword Griffin is notably understated compared to Yoru. No supreme grade classification of what we know. Just a working weapon for a man who has larger concerns. 3 scars across his left eye from Blackbeard, the one enemy he openly acknowledges as a genuine threat. Mihawk is the weapon perfected. Every element of his design points toward function. He is what a sword becomes when you strip away everything that isn't cutting. Shanks is the man who could be a weapon, but chose to be something else. Every element of his design points toward connection. And now, rebellion. He is what a celestial dragon becomes when he decides that the entire concept of gods and their blades needs to end. Mihawk appears out of fog on a tiny boat, bisecting ships as he goes, lonely and self-contained. Shanks appears with his crew behind him, cape blowing, the camera pulling back to show the scale of what he represents. Before Elbaf, the Mihawk-Shanks mirror was elegant but somewhat simple. The loner versus the leader, the perfectionist versus the pragmatist. After Elbaf, it's something far more layered. Shanks Figureland was born into the highest possible station in the One Piece world. A celestial dragon, son of Garling, twin of the Holy Knight's commander. He was raised by Roger, returned to marry Joe, pretended to rejoin the system, committed an act of massive sabotage, freeing Fisher Tiger and the slaves, and then fled, severing his bond to Emu by sacrificing his arm. Mihawk was born into nothing, as far as we know. No noble lineage, no cosmic covenant, no twin brother leading an army of God's knights. Just a man, a sword, and an obsession with being the strongest. He was betrayed by the Marines, turned to hunting them, and eventually made an uneasy truce. The mirror becomes richer when you see it this way. Mihawk is power that emerged from nothing. Self-made, self-contained, self-limiting. Shanks is power that emerged from everything. Born with every advantage, every connection, every institutional weapon, and then systematically dismantled all of it in pursuit of something the institutions couldn't offer. Mihawk is the sword that sharpened itself into perfection, and then had nowhere left to cut. Shanks is the celestial dragon who broke his own chains, and then spent his life quietly breaking everyone else's. Mihawk and Shanks are the final exam versions of Zoro and Luffy. Zoro's dream is to become the strongest swordsman. Mihawk is the strongest swordsman, and Mihawk's life is a cautionary tale about what happens when you achieve a dream defined only by surpassing. Once you surpass everyone, there's no one left, and the dream becomes an empty room you pace inside forever. The Vivre card says Mihawk is waiting for someone stronger than Shanks to challenge him. That someone is Zoro, but Zoro will have to become stronger than Mihawk and avoid becoming him. He has to prove that you can be the greatest swordsman and have something to fight for beyond the title. That's what his commitment to Luffy gives him that Mihawk never had. A reason to be strong that isn't strength itself. Luffy's dream is to become the Pirate King, to be the freest person on the sea. Shanks is, in many ways, already the freest pirate alive. He does what he wants, goes where he wants, fights only when he chooses. But the Elbaf revelations have shown that Shanks may be less free than he appears. Not just burdened by knowledge, but actively bound by a mission inherited from Roger. He staked a claim on the One Piece only after Luffy awakened Nika. He stole the fruit specifically because Roger told him about Joy Boy. He has been managing the flow of history rather than living within it. Luffy will have to find a freedom that Shanks couldn't. A freedom that isn't shadowed by obligation, by secret covenants, by the weight of being the man who keeps the world from tipping over. Mihawk looks free. No crew, no obligations, a castle and a sword, and all the time in the world. But he's profoundly trapped. Trapped by the emptiness of supremacy. Trapped by the loss of his only worthy rival. Trapped by a worldview that doesn't permit him to value anything other than the blade. His joining Cross Guild might actually be the most liberated decision Mihawk has ever made, because it means admitting, however reluctantly, that surviving alone isn't the same as living. Shanks looks constrained by his crew, his responsibilities, his apparent role as the world's thermostat, his Figureland blood, his years undercover as a devoted blade. But within those constraints, he's more alive than Mihawk has ever been. He laughs, he drinks, he cries when Roger tells him something we still don't fully understand. He gives away irreplaceable things, an arm, a hat, a future, his own branded arm, and finds that the giving makes him larger, not smaller. The ultimate irony is that the man with no attachments is imprisoned. The man with every attachment is free. And the deeper irony, courtesy of Elbaf, is that Shanks was once literally imprisoned. By covenant, by lineage, by the tattoo on his arm. He escaped by choosing to sacrifice. Mihawk was never imprisoned by anyone. He imprisoned himself. Luffy's journey to the One Piece is not just about finding treasure. It's about proving that a particular philosophy of life is the right one. And to do that, the story needs to show what the alternatives look like when they're taken to their absolute extremes. Mihawk is the alternative where you perfect yourself in isolation, where your blade becomes a black blade through sheer accumulated mastery, and you sit in your castle with your wine and your newspaper, and you watch the world burn or bloom with equal detachment. He is beautiful and tragic and necessary, because someone has to stand at the peak to show that the peak alone isn't enough. Shanks is the alternative where you invest yourself in others, where you lose an arm and gain a legacy, where you could claim a throne in the Holy Land but choose to sail a pirate ship instead, where you infiltrate the most powerful institution on the planet, free its slaves, burn your own covenant, and then spend the next decade smiling like nothing happened. He is warm and terrifying and unknowable, because someone has to show that power wielded in service of something beyond yourself is the only power worth having, even when wielding it means carrying secrets that would shatter everyone's trust. The story needs them both because Luffy and Zoro need to see both paths. Zoro needs to beat Mihawk's sword and escape Mihawk's loneliness. Luffy needs to surpass Shank's influence and avoid Shank's secrets, to find a version of freedom that doesn't require playing God's chess game. And someday, when Zoro holds a black blade of his own and Luffy wears the straw hat one final time, they'll look back at the two men who stood over them at the start, and they'll understand. The mirrors were never there to be copied. They were there to be shattered.